Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be reviewing two more books from the Walter Scott Prize shortlist: The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller and The Book of Days by Francesca Kay. So I've now read two more books from the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction shortlist. If you don't know what the Walter Scott Prize is, I will leave some other videos I've done down below about this prize, but I have been reading along with the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for quite a few years now, and I always find a lot of new gems and really enjoy my reading experience. And I've now read 5 out of the 6 books on this year's shortlist, and I've also read several more from the long list. So these 2 books are both from the shortlist, and then I've got one more book from the shortlist to read, which is The Safe Keep by Yael van der Wooden. My library audiobook hold has just come in, so I'm excited to get to that. And then there's also 2 more books I want to read from the long list and that didn't make it onto the shortlist: A Sign of Her Own by Sarah Marsh and The First Friend by Malcolm Knox. But today I'm going to be talking about The Land in Winter and The Book of Days. I have a copy out of The Land in Winter out from the library, but the library cover is making it very shiny, so maybe I will put this down and put the book cover up on the screen instead. So I think let's start off with The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller, which is the one I liked most of the 2, I would say, although I did also really like The Book of Days. So The Land in Winter is a fascinating novel. It's set in December 1962 and January 1963, and we're following 2 couples who are next door neighbours in a rural village in the West Country, and we're following how their lives begin to crumble, I suppose, over the course of one winter. There are quite a lot of similarities kind of between these couples in some ways. So both the women, Irene and Rita, are pregnant, and both of them have slightly different social and class backgrounds from their husband. So Irene is much posher than her husband, Eric, who is a doctor but has kind of worked his way up. And Rita is from a much more working class background than her husband, Bill. Although it's a bit complicated because Bill is very, very posh in many ways and comes from quite a well-off background, but his father was not very posh, and more about his father's background kind of comes out later in the story. And both of these couples have kind of some difficulties and some secrets potentially in their marriage. We know very early on in the book that Eric, the doctor, is having an affair, and we know that there are some things that Rita and Bill aren't talking about. And the book is in some ways quite a quiet novel, not that much happens in some ways, although there are some quite dramatic moments. But most of the time we are following the day-to-day lives of these people, and the slow tensions and slow struggles in their lives. And on the one hand, I didn't love it quite as much as I loved the previous book I've read by Andrew Miller, Now We Should Be Entirely Free, which was much faster pace. But on the other hand, I thought it really worked, and there's something quite suffocating and tense about so many things within this book. And there are so many moments, sort of quiet moments, where Rita and Irene, they kind of become friends and they have conversations which are not hugely deep, but you see how both of them are sort of starved for connection, and therefore you see what these conversations mean. So even if, like, in some ways it feels quite quiet, it also feels really impactful. There was so much I loved about The Land in Winter. I thought the characterization was just excellent. Like, all of the characterization was just top-notch, really subtle, really complex, really interesting. And I also loved how the novel looked at the 1960s as a time period, the social shifts happening, but how they're not happening that much, and they're not happening for everyone. I feel like the complexities of that time period were captured so well. The way it looks at class in the 1960s and social mobility and social changes, and again, how things are changing, but not that much. All of that stuff was fascinating. And I feel like one of the things I loved most about The Land in Winter was the way it looked at the long legacy of the Second World War. The Second World War hangs over all of these characters. You know, I think a lot of us, certainly of my generation, we think of the 1960s as quite, like, far away from the 1940s. I think that's probably because I'm of the generation where my parents were born in the 1960s. So the 1960s don't feel as long ago to me as the 1940s or the 1950s do. And we look at those time periods as quite sort of socially different in some ways, you know, even just thinking about like fashion and things like that. The 1940s and 1960s look very different in our imagination. But actually 1962 is only 17 years after the end of the Second World War, and the characters in this book were all alive during the Second World War. Some of them were children, but some of them were older. And the legacy of that and how it hangs over so many people in this book was fascinating. And it really works because it's not that near the surface, but it is a shadow that hangs over the whole novel. And there's one or two moments where you find out more about particular characters' background during the Second World War in a way that just changes things. And it's great, and it works really, really well. In a way you feel like the whole country is, still in the shadow of war. And actually, I'm really interested to read The Safekeep by Yael van der Wooden, which is the final book I have to read from the shortlist. And I kind of feel like if I'd have planned it better, / if my library hold had come in earlier for that book, and wasn't due back for The Land in Winter, then I would have reviewed them together, because they're both set in the very early 1960s, and they both, I believe, look at the long legacy of the Second World War, The Land in Winter in England and The Safekeep in the Netherlands. So I'm quite interested to read that and see kind of if there are interesting comparison points between them. But anyway, I thought that worked really, really well in The Land in Winter, and that was one theme that I, found very, very impactful. There were a lot of other themes that I found impactful. As I mentioned, both Irene and Rita are pregnant, and I thought the way the book looks at pregnancy was really, really interesting, and some of the sort of really powerful moments of the novel surround that. And I also thought it was a kind of interesting way into 1960s social history and 1960s women's history. And I think the way the book looks at the position of women and the kind of lack of choices so many women had. And I think because the 1960s in popular culture is often like this time of great freedom, but was it? I think the way Andrew Miller kind of tackles that and engages with that was really, really interesting. I also thought the characterization was great. I feel like I've said that already, but I feel like all the characterization was really complex and worked really well. I kind of hated Eric, the Doctor, in so many moments in this book, but he did feel quite real, and I really liked both Rita and Irene, and I thought Bill was very interesting too. Everyone felt quite human, even if occasionally pushed to extremes. One other thing I really liked about this book is quite hard to explain, but it is quite odd in some ways, and there are a few things that are a bit surreal, but kind of really worked. And one thing I really liked in the end of this book, in the acknowledgements, Andrew Miller thanks his agent, and he says, "With warm thanks to the following. My agent, Tracy Bowen, who said wonderfully, keep it weird." I assume that means that his agent said to this book, keep it weird. And it is a bit weird. And it's not that weird, but there's just a few things in it that are quite odd, but that I quite liked. Like, there are a few scenes and sequences that are a bit strange. But for me, that really worked. And I think part of why it really worked is because we're following these characters over this long, dark winter where it keeps snowing, the weather is terrible, it's hard to move around, everything is quite suffocating and so cold. And everyone is slightly unraveling, and it also feels like the country, the world is unraveling too. And that worked really well and was very, very effective, and meant some of the stranger moments felt really powerful. I should say as well that I just really love the way Andrew Miller writes. I think he's got a real gift with dialogue, and there's something about his phrasing that I really enjoy. It's definitely on the slightly more literary end of my taste, but it's very like accessible literary fiction. I feel like Andrew Miller is literary in the sense of like overarching stuff rather than like sentence by sentence being a bit impenetrable. Like, that's not the case at all with his writing. It's very clear and precise. The one thing I think was probably slightly too literary for my taste was the ending, which was quite ambiguous. And I know that was the point, but I would have kind of liked 3 pages more and to have had less ambiguity. But that is definitely all about personal taste. I think I've said this before, I do sometimes find when I read works of literary fiction that I want a more tied up ending than literary fiction often tends to have. And The Land in Winter definitely does not have a tied up ending. But I did think the ending was great, and I think especially like the final few chapters I thought were incredible, and then the final chapter I just wanted like 2 more chapters, 2 more pages. But you know, I do think it really worked. I just think for me personally I would have kind of liked a little bit more. But anyway, so yeah, I thought The Land in Winter was great, and I'm very pleased that it made the shortlist. So next, let's talk about The Book of Days by Francesca Kay. So The Book of Days is set in the Tudor period at the very end of Henry VIII's reign, and the book looks quite a lot at the Reformation and kind of religious changes and concerns during this point in time. We're following a woman called Alice. I don't think we ever know how old Alice is, but I presume she is fairly young, and she's married to an older man. It's his second marriage, and he has a daughter from his first marriage. The daughter, Agnes, is a teenager. She's kind of on the cusp between childhood and adulthood. And Alice and her stepdaughter don't have a great relationship. Alice and her husband have been married a couple of years, and we know from the beginning of the book that Alice gave birth to a baby who only lived a few days. And Alice kind of begins the book in grief. But she has kind of two griefs, I suppose, in a way. She has the grief for the child she has lost, and also the kind of expected grief for her husband, because he is very, very ill. And through a lot of the book, they think he will sort of die any day. They don't know whether he's going to recover. They think it's unlikely. And so Alice is kind of living in this state of uncertainty about the future. Her husband's kind of dying wish, I suppose, the final project he wants to see through before he dies is renovation to the church, the building of a tomb, and various changes to the building. So a lot of the book kind of looks at the changes going on in the church, which kind of ties in with the themes of religion, but also with the themes of death, because partly what he's having built is a tomb. And we follow Alice kind of through the seasons as her husband's circumstances change and as various other things change around her. There was a lot in the Book of Days that I found really, really interesting. It's quite a short book, and the ending was fantastic. And I feel like in a way it is one of those novels that is working towards the ending, and it is kind of everything is sort of there as a setup to the final moment. That's not quite right, but I feel like a lot of the power of the book came from the ending for me. And there were times kind of in the middle of the book where I was curious to see where it was going, but was kind of hanging on for that final moment. And I do think the ending and kind of how many themes come together at the ending worked really, really well. In general, I would say this book has like three main themes, and it's quite thematically focused, I suppose. Like, it's quite a quiet novel, it's quite slow. There are some things that happen towards the end which I think work really, really well and which are more dramatic, but quite a lot of the book is quite quiet. But there's sort of like a lot of complicated themes going on beneath the surface which work really, really well. One of the big themes in the book is definitely nature and kind of like the changing of the seasons. It's called The Book of Days, which obviously has sort of religious connotations because it sounds like the Book of Hours, and the book is organised by days. So each chapter will begin like a Tuesday in August or something like that. And then we'll have her day, and Alice will tell us about her experiences that day and what happened that day. And because the book spans quite a long period of time, we see a lot of changing in seasons and a lot of how kind of nature and the world changes around Alice, which I think is an important theme in the book, but I am not really one for nature writing, so I feel like that theme didn't quite connect with me in the way that it might have connected with other readers. I think there's probably some interesting stuff done there about how the natural world changes and also the kind of like manufactured world changes. There's a lot of social and religious and political change going on at this point in time. It's a really turbulent time, and it both kind of has been a very turbulent time in recent years, but also more turbulence is coming. And the way that kind of interacts with the Reformation is very, very interesting, which kind of leads me on to the second main theme in this book, which is religion. And the way it looks at religion is very, very interesting, both in terms of faith, but also in terms of like the performance of religion and the very different ways that people can engage with Christianity, and how there is a shift away from older traditions that are now considered more Catholic to things that are considered more in keeping with the new Church of England, but how complicated that is and how things aren't quite clear yet, and the sort of complicated shift from Catholicism to Protestantism in England at this point in time was explored in a really interesting way. I think the theme that I kind of found the most interesting in the Book of Days was the theme of grief, which is a really, really important theme throughout the novel in many ways. And actually it ties quite significantly into religion in terms of how you grieve for people and how that works with the church that you are part of, and how grief and death were so bound up with religion at this point in time. I thought that was very interestingly done. But the way this book looks at grief, and especially Alice's grief for her child, and her sort of forthcoming grief for her husband that she is sort of always on the edge of, like, I thought all of that was so complicated and so well done and really poignantly drawn. And a lot of my favourite passages in the novel are passages with Alice thinking about her child. The raw pain of that was so well drawn, and was definitely the thing in the novel I found the most engaging. And some of that as well kind of ties into women's history, Alice's place within the household, her lack of a place within the household, how she is considered by her time to be like there to provide children. And so the fact that her baby died is both a source of immense grief, but also it means that her position within the household is almost a threat. And especially with her husband ill and her separated from her husband because of her illness, she doesn't really feel like she has a place. She came from her father's house to here. If her husband dies, she doesn't know if she'll be able to stay in this home. And that aspect of the book I thought was really interesting too. The one thing I would have liked a bit more in this novel, I think, was a bit more engagement with class, because there is a little bit of it, but there's not that much. And I suppose, like, as someone really, really interested in social history, that's something I'm really interested in. And I would have liked a bit more of that. But, you know, I think that's personal taste. That's not what this book is about. But I suppose when I read historical fiction, like, that's something I'm always on the lookout for. And maybe also because I just read The Land in Winter, and The Land in Winter deals quite a lot with that. I kind of wanted a bit more of that in here, but there we go. I didn't read the Book of Days physically. I listened to the audiobook, which I enjoyed, thought it was very well narrated, and I would recommend it. Although I feel like it's not one of those books where I'd be like, yes, you have to listen to it on audiobook. I feel like you'd probably have a very good experience reading it too. Whereas like Glorious Exploits, my favourite book from the shortlist, you should listen to it. The audiobook's the best. So yeah, those are the two books that I've just read from the shortlist, both of which I found really interesting and got a lot out of. The Land in Winter was definitely my preferred book of the two. I really loved The Land in Winter. I did really like the Book of Days. I found it really interesting, but I think it's probably one of those books where I think it's very, very good at what it's doing, but what it's doing is something I find interesting, but not like my absolute favourite thing, in comparison to some of the other books on the long list, I suppose. So of the 5 books I've read from the shortlist so far, my absolute favourite to win is still Glorious Exploits, which is incredible and amazing. My next favourite to win would be The Mayor, which I also thought was great. Really, really strong novel, very, very important and impactful. And then probably after that, The Land in Winter, I would also be very happy to see win too. If I were ranking them, I'd probably then put the Book of Days and then The Heart in Winter. I got more out of the Book of Days than I did out of The Heart in Winter, and I found it easier to engage with. But I think if I were putting together my own shortlist, I suppose I would probably replace The Heart in Winter and the Book of Days with Mother Naked by Glenn James Brown and Clear by Karen Davis, both of which I thought were fantastic. And I'm still very sad that neither of them made the shortlist because I thought they were so good. And I thought both of them were incredible, but Mother Naked I think I just especially loved for its cleverness. That is enough rambling from me. I need to go away and read The Safe Keep and also the 2 others from the long list I'd like to read. And then I suppose I will come back in a few weeks and do a review of them and give you my final thoughts on the shortlist and my predictions for the winner. What do I think about predictions for the winner? I think I want Glorious Exploits to win, but I don't think Glorious Exploits will win. But I really want it to, because it's the best, but I don't know. Anyway, that's all for now. Do let me know if you've read either of these books and what you thought of them. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.